All right, welcome everybody to this talk organized by Scientist Rebellion. I'm Fabian and I will be your host for today. For those of you who don't know it, Scientist Rebellion is an international group comprised of scientists and academics engaging in, among other things, civil disobedience to help press for urgent action on the climate and ecological crisis. And today we are very excited to have Kevin Young as a speaker. Kevin is Associate Professor of History at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His research and teaching interests are in social movements, revolution, labor, political economy, and imperialism in modern Latin America and the United States. He has written and edited a number of books, including Blood of the Earth, Resource Nationalism, Revolution, and Empire in Bolivia, Levers of Power, How the 1% Rules and What the 99% Can Do About It, and Trump and the Deeper Crisis. His most recent book, published last year, is Abolishing Fossil Fuels, Lessons from Movements That Won, which is both an insightful and dare I say, hopeful book, and a book that forms the impetus for today's talk. So in terms of the structure of today's event, Kevin will talk for about 30 minutes, followed by a Q&A. And after the Q&A, there will be about a 5-minute talk on Scientist Rebellion to give you a bit more background and information if you're interested. And then we will create breakout rooms based on geographical location so that you can connect with others if you want to. But now, without further ado, Kevin, please take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Fabian. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all, and thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate the invitation and look forward to hearing thoughts from the audience. So I'm not going to waste time talking about the science. I don't think I need to do that with this audience. You all know that we are in an extremely difficult situation in the world. The situation is dire, and the climate movement is not winning by any measure. But I do want to talk a little bit about how we might win and how I think that the movement has made some positive progress in recent years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think we can learn from some of the past, from some of the successful social movements of the past. And I'm going to talk about U.S. history since that's the context I'm most familiar with. I know we're a worldwide audience here, but I think that some of the arguments about the way that political power operates are more generalizable to all capitalist societies. So, given the situation that we're in, especially after the re-election of Donald Trump and the recolonization of the US government by the fossil fuel industry, most people that I know, even without them saying it, I've sensed a pervasive despair, maybe even bordering on nihilism, a sense that we can't possibly do anything. Bernie Sanders, right before the election, said if Donald Trump gets reelected, the fight for the climate is over. And even in polls from recent years, we see that this sentiment is very widespread. There are polls showing that among the world's young people, over half of them agree with the statement that humanity is doomed. Right? And they also, over half of them also think that they are completely helpless to affect any change in the situation. So those are striking findings from polls, and they very much align with my own personal interactions, especially lately, to the point where most people, I think, don't even want to think about the climate. Even people who are on the left don't really want to think about it, or don't want to make it central to their daily work and their daily lives. This is understandable. I think it's psychologically and emotionally understandable. I struggle with those sentiments too. But what I'm going to try to do is to show why that argument is false. That is not only why it's self-defeating. Of course, we can't build a movement if everybody is pessimistic about the chances for success. Nobody believes we can do anything. then we're not going to draw more people into the movement. So it's self-defeating, but it's also empirically wrong or misleading in some important ways, which I want to point to. The fossil fuel industry remains vulnerable. Yes, they have record profits right now. They're celebrating the return of Donald Trump. They are making plans for continued fossil fuel extraction long into the future. But if you look beneath the surface a little bit and look at their journals, the way that they're talking about the climate movement, the way that they're talking about the long-term investment prospects, you'll notice that there's a lot more unease, a lot more concern about the medium to long-term future. And that reflects the industry's vulnerability. And the industry is going to continue to be vulnerable even under the Trump administration. So if we go back to Trump's first term in office, there's some surprising data points that we could point to. Surprisingly, some of the US climate movement's most important victories actually came under Donald Trump. So 2 examples. Trump campaigned, of course, as the president who was going to revive the US coal industry. Right? So what actually happened during his time in office? Well, the US coal industry declined faster than it has under any other US president. And in fact, it declined faster than it has in any comparable 4-year period anywhere in the world. So the president who campaigned on a pledge to revive the US coal industry and to be the best president in world history for the coal industry was actually the worst president in history for the coal industry. Now, I'm being a little dramatic here, but the point is that Trump was unable to prevent the continued decline of the coal industry. There was more coal-fired power plant capacity retired during his 4 years in office than during any other 4-year period. Right? And that includes the Biden administration too. Second data point, the wind energy sector expanded faster under Trump. This is in the United States, expanded faster under Trump than under any other president, right? Including Biden. So, you know, again, this has nothing to do with Trump himself, but it does speak to the limited control that a US president has over these developments. So I raise these examples to point to the fact that there are many other variables at play, some of which we as a movement have the power to impact, right? And so to understand who holds the reins of power, we're not just looking at the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. There are other pressure points and leverage points that we can talk about. So I want to talk about what some of those are. And I want to start by looking at some historical movements and spend a few minutes on these. And I'm going to focus in on 2 movements which are very well known, certainly to people in the US and probably to many of you outside the US as well. So I'm going to have a couple of slides here that I wanted to share. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. So the title of the presentation is basically just a rewording of the title of the book that I recently published. Okay, so I'm going to argue that some of the most powerful movements in US history have succeeded in large part because they were able to do 3 things. Well, there are 3 common ingredients that we could point to as essential to their success. So I'm focusing on, first of all, their ability to disrupt capital, right? That is to say, their ability to cut off or to threaten the resources on which capitalists depend. Usually that means labor, money in the form of consumption, and or investment resources, right? So the movements that I'm going to be talking about both did that. In some important ways, the climate movement has started to to do that to a lesser extent. And this ingredient or this strategy, right, was based on a recognition that in capitalist societies, it's ultimately capitalists who hold the real power. It's not so much the politicians. And by disrupting capital, they could not only change things within the domain of a particular business or industry, but they could also contribute to change at the level of government policy. So I'm going to talk about a couple examples. Second, the movements were sustained and escalating. They showed no sign of dying out, and their elite targets conceded to the movements only when they came to believe that the movements were going to continue, right? And not only continue, but potentially escalate and radicalize. The fear of escalation and radicalization is something common to both the movements I'm going to talk about. And then third, the movements singled out key targets. They didn't target the elite in general. They didn't even necessarily target the entities which were most overtly responsible for the problem, right? So think about the fossil fuel industry. That's just one of many targets. There are other targets that we could think about with the climate movement that are potentially more vulnerable and more likely to favor concessions to the movement if we put pressure on them. So I'm thinking about the financial sector, for instance. Okay, so first example is the 1930s. This is one of the most important elements in the New Deal in the United States, the National Labor Relations Act, otherwise known as the Wagner Act for Senator Robert Wagner. This was passed in 1935, and it guaranteed, at least on paper, the right of all private sector workers to unionize and engage in collective bargaining. Right? So this is one of the most important pieces of reform legislation in US history. Now, the standard story about the National Labor Relations Act puts a lot of emphasis on Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the election of liberal and progressive reformers into the US government in the wake of the start of the Great Depression. Right? So, there are particular details to that narrative that we could look at. So the election of 1932, followed by the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was sort of the predecessor to the NLRA. There is a particular clause within that 1933 act that nominally guaranteed the right of workers to unionize, right? It didn't actually do that in practice, but the conventional narrative holds that clause inspired and emboldened workers all around the country to begin unionizing, right? Then by 1935, we get, and this is after the midterm elections of 1934, where more Democrats come into office, we get the 1935 Act, passes Congress, it's signed by Roosevelt. And then in the aftermath of that passage, the 1936 election brings more Democrats into office. In 1937, the Supreme Court approves or confirms the validity of the Wagner Act. Right. So by the late 30s, we get a firmly established right to unionize. Right. And that story places a lot of importance on the election of Democrats. Right. And having friends in high places. Right. But if we look closer at each of those junctures, we see that the causation was a little bit different, certainly more complicated. And the movement succeeded because it did all of these things, which I'm going to say a bit about. So if we go back to before the 1932 election, there was a seldom remembered wave of organizing in the coal industry in the United States, which is almost always forgotten, even in labor histories of the time period. But there was a massive wave of organizing and upheaval within the coal industry before Roosevelt is elected. And it's also led by radicals, often communists, often organizing multiracial or interracial unions in which the leadership of the unions was racially integrated, which was a huge deal for that time. And it was the fear of capitalists that that movement was going to spread and that it was going to lead to the growth of the communist movement. Many of these people were communists that led many of them to favor congressional reform in the form of the 1933 Act and then later the Wagner Act. Right, so that fear of radicalization and escalation was an important causal factor here. In 1934, there were around 1,900 strikes across the United States. 1.5 million workers went on strike. And that fear of continued and escalating strike activity was a crucial factor in the 1935 congressional vote on the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act was an attempt to stem that tide of labor disruption. If we look at the aftermath of the passage of the act, and I said that it was passed on paper, but it was essentially a dead letter when it was unenforced almost universally after it became law in 1935. Most employers around the country simply ignored it. Certainly the big employers, places like the auto industry, GM and Ford and the rest, just ignored the law. So in order for the law to actually be enforced, it took another wave of labor upheaval and disruption in the form of strikes to actually bring about the enforcement. And they brought about the enforcement of the law not so much by appealing to government, not by lobbying government to intervene, but by imposing direct costs on the capitalists themselves. So the two photographs that you see on the right-hand side, the center photograph and the photograph on the right, both come from Flint, Michigan, a center of the auto industry in early 1937. These were during the famous sit-down strikes in the General Motors plants, which went on for 44 days. They occupied the factories. And they held out against the bosses who tried to retake the factories. And they eventually forced GM to capitulate. After 44 days, GM cracks and it says, we will concede to the unionization of our plants under the United Auto Workers. Right. So this was probably the most pivotal episode in the fight for unionization rights in the US. It's immediately followed by similar events in the steel industry. The steel industry capitalists also capitulate right afterward. And notably, this is before the Supreme Court upholds the Wagner Act in April of 1937. Right? The workers themselves had upheld the act before the Supreme Court did. And throughout 1937, there's, close to 500 sit-down strikes across the United States. This is part of a larger wave of labor disruption. So the fear of a sustained and escalating and radicalizing movement was essential here. The singling out of General Motors was particularly important here. And the organizers did this very consciously because GM was at the pinnacle of US capitalism. It was the quintessential modern US corporation. It was the largest force in the auto industry. And it sort of set the tone or the pace for the mass production industries in general. So once GM surrendered to the unionization drive, then other companies, first within the auto industry and then in other mass production industries, they followed suit. And that's what made it possible for the government to then actually begin enforcing the law. They began enforcing the law with the consent and in many times the invitation of the employers themselves, who wanted to enforce the act as an alternative to more radical and endemic disruption in their workplaces. Right? So singling out one target for sustained pressure led to change at broader levels. So this episode is an example of how the withdrawal of labor can generate political power. The second example is about the withdrawal of consumer money in the form of boycotts and economic pressure. So here, another very famous example from US history is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race and a number of other factors in public accommodations and employment and other realms. So the conventional story about how this act was possible is that this very famous photograph and others like it of Black demonstrators being viciously attacked by dogs and then fire hoses in May of 1963 elicited an enormous outpouring of sympathy and outrage all across the world, and particularly in the north of the United States. And that then led the Kennedy administration to introduce civil rights legislation. It led the Congress to pass that legislation. And then under Lyndon Johnson in 64, we finally get the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So this narrative emphasizes the role of shock and outrage and the appeal to an external constituency. In this case, primarily liberal white people in the North who were the voting base of the Northern Democrats, like Kennedy. Right? This causal argument seriously obscures the actual chain of events that led to the passage and implementation of the act. One of the key aspects, probably the central aspect of the strategy in Birmingham, of the organizers in Birmingham, was the economic pressure campaign. And this is sometimes not even mentioned in current day accounts about Birmingham, but the boycott was central to their strategy. It went on for 5 weeks, and it cost the retailers in Birmingham millions of dollars, right? To the point where they end up surrendering to the movement and arguing for racial integration. They integrate their own businesses, and then they also go to Bull Connor, the police chief, and the mayor and the school administrators, and demand that they also integrate, right? As a way of placating the movement and ending this disruption to their business. Right? So the boycott here was central. They coordinated with other forces around the country. Here's a march from New York City in April of 1963. And the sign also indicates the way that they singled out particular business targets, like the Woolworth Company, which had businesses in both the North and the South. Right? This is a report from the business press, actually a few years earlier, for generating political pressure, right, by the Southern Black movement. And this strategy was part of a political strategy too. It wasn't just trying to integrate the employers themselves. The organizers were very clear, certainly afterward, that they were trying to pressure the employers and the retailers in order to generate political pressure at the level of government. Right? So here's some quotes from some of the key organizers in that campaign, and a quote from MLK himself. Later in the year, he's reflecting on the victory at Birmingham, and the last sentence, the last line, is really the key part of that quote. He says, "The political power structure listens to the economic power structure." He's reflecting on Birmingham, saying that we were able to impose enough cost, enough disruption on the businesses in Birmingham that they then advocated for racial integration, right? And they were able to force the government to do that. One of the key figures here among the elite, right, maybe the most prominent business elite in Birmingham at the time, was this guy, Sidney Smyer. And he was very clear about why he capitulated to the movement, right? It wasn't that he wasn't a racist or even that he opposed segregation, but he recognized that it was in his own business interest to surrender to the movement and integrate. Right. So this is another example, maybe this is actually a clearer example of a case where people who were completely disenfranchised by the political system in which they lived, talking about Black people in the South, the early 60s, completely excluded from political power of any kind. They were nonetheless able to generate powerful political pressure through their collective action and through the boycott in particular. All right, now, so coming to the climate movement and what I think some of the lessons of these two episodes. So this slide here, which is the last one, and then we'll open it up. I recently wrote a piece for the outlet Truth Out, where I was trying to be a little bit encouraging to the climate movement in the wake of the Trump re-election by pointing to 12 concrete ways that the movement actually can make a difference, specifically ways that it can exploit what I think are the continued vulnerabilities of the fossil fuel industry. And this list of suggestions is entirely unoriginal. I didn't invent any of these ideas. I'm drawing from what I've observed of the climate movement, especially in the US, but also globally, over the last 2 decades or so, and some of the things that I think have worked or have at least allowed the movement to make progress. Right. So I wanted to point to some very concrete things that movements everywhere can still do, even when the electoral context at the national level in their countries is hostile to the climate movement. So this list partly follows on the arguments that I was making about those two historical movements in the 30s and the 60s, but it's also a little bit broader, right? Because obviously we can't just replicate historical strategies in the present. We need to be creative and adaptive and thoughtful about how the conditions in the present are different. Okay, so I'm going to go kind of quickly through these for the sake of time. All right, so of course, protesting every fossil fuel project, every extraction site, every pipeline, every dirty power plant, and so on. This is sort of an obvious one, but public protests have a way of galvanizing public pressure, raising the awareness and the attention on a particular industry or company, and helping to generate action in other realms as well. So the physical protest of these fossil fuel projects on site or at the headquarters of the company is very important, even if it doesn't seem to have necessarily a direct immediate impact on the company. Right? And this is especially powerful when climate organizers work hand in hand with environmental justice organizations, Indigenous groups.
We've lost the audio.
Amplify each other's.
Kevin, we just lost you for a little bit. Are you still there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, we can hear you again now. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So number one, protest every project. Maybe that's obvious. There remains major potential for lawsuits and litigation in our environment, right? And this takes advantage of the fact that the judicial system itself is it's not monolithic. There are places where the movement can perhaps expect a little bit more vulnerability, depending on who appointed the judges and so on. All right, and lawsuits, if we look at the press, if we look at the journals that the fossil fuel industry looks to, right, obscure industry journals, they are very concerned about lawsuits. Lawsuits do significantly delay and disrupt their business plans. They're concerned that if a particular lawsuit, right, it doesn't have to be every lawsuit, but if enough lawsuits go against them, then that can seriously jeopardize their access to stable investment capital. Right? By raising investors' perception of the risk attached to fossil fuel projects. If there's a substantial risk in the eyes of investors that a particular project is not going to be allowed to go through, or that it's even worse, that it's going to be canceled and shut down after it's actually been completed, after a pipeline has been completed, for example, that's an enormous threat to them. Right? So lawsuits aren't the most exciting form of resistance, but they are very important to support in any way we can. Third, the targeting of financial institutions and investors. So this is something that the movement around the world has done more and more in recent years. The divestment movement has expanded beyond just the targeting of investors themselves and institutional investors to also targeting banks and insurance companies and asset managers who are financially tied to the fossil fuel industry, right? And this has had some success. Not as much as we would have liked. The top banks are still pouring in trillions of dollars in the wake of the Paris Climate Accord. Over the last decade, they've poured in close to $6 billion, probably more by now. 6 trillion, excuse me, into fossil fuels. But that big picture statistic obscures some of the progress around the edges that we have made in terms of pressuring particular banks to cut down on their funding of the fossil fuel industry, and particular insurance companies too. The movement targeting insurance companies has made some headway, especially in the coal sector, right? Especially in putting pressure on insurers to withhold insurance from coal or to raise the price for it. And that's not only because of the movement, of course. The decline of coal and the difficulty of the coal companies in getting capital and insurance also reflects market trends. It reflects the rise of natural gas and so on, especially in the US. But the movement is an important force there, helping to amplify that market signal. And without the intervention of the movement, and there are particular episodes we could point to, the insurance companies would still be insuring coal to a greater extent. Fighting for legislative reform at lower levels of government when the national government is captured by the fossil fuel industry. This is an approach that has had some success in the United States in recent years, and it can't be dismissed. Even though the argument that I was making about those historical movements is not focused on legislative battles, this is one important approach that the movement needs to keep in mind. Similarly, at the local level, legislation that particularly legislation that reduces demand for fossil fuels. So local prohibitions on new gas hookups, for example, right? Or on the use of fossil fuels in new buildings, right? They're all, there's a slowly proliferating number of cities and towns across the US that have banned fossil fuels in new buildings. And that has an impact on the overall demand forecast for the industry, for the fossil fuel industries, right? They are worried about that. Pressure large institutions to stop burning fossil fuels. So those of us who are in universities or faith institutions, right? Particularly universities, perhaps, can play an important role in reducing the demand for fossil fuels by working through our institutions. Right now at my institution, there's a carbon zero plan that the university administration announced several years ago, and the plan has virtually stalled. They've walked back on their promises as of today. So we're trying to rebuild the campaign to actually hold them to those promises, right? And this is a context in which my university, UMass Amherst, is the largest public sector contributor of carbon emissions in the state of Massachusetts, right? So it's not an insignificant level of pollution. In addition to that, we can punish the dirtiest companies, the worst polluters, with boycotts. This isn't something that I think has been very developed as an element in the movement strategy, but it does have real potential. And polls show that consumers already practice this on their own, right? Millions and millions of consumers in the US, for example, tens of millions, already, at least they tell pollsters that they try to punish the most environmentally irresponsible companies. Another approach is to try to block what we might call the recruitment pipeline. Right? This is a term that some organizers themselves use. Another key site for this is at the university, right? Organizing students to protest at career fairs, or to there's one approach that has been tried primarily outside the US, I think maybe in the UK and elsewhere, is to organize students to pledge not to take jobs at banks and insurance companies that are linked to fossil fuels. And there are particular campaigns. I think there's a campaign targeting Lloyd's of London right now, if I'm not mistaken. And that's something that does threaten the labor supply of those companies. Even though it's not in the form of a strike, it does threaten their access to labor. Organizing the workplace. All right. Obviously, one of the most powerful tools that we would have if we could pull it off would be a general strike, right? You talk about bringing any industry to heel. You have a mass strike, a sustained mass strike. All right? We're not at that point yet, and we won't be for the near future. But organizing the workplace is important as a step in that direction. It can play a role in there's a number of reasons why it's important. One reason it's important, in addition to actually potentially reducing the fossil fuel consumption of employers and raising the costs of continued fossil fuel consumption to the targets, is that building strong labor unions prevents elite actors from transferring the costs of the climate crisis onto working people. So you probably heard the studies of the tens and tens of trillions of dollars that the climate crisis is already costing the global economy. Most of that cost, of course, is going to be paid by working people unless we can prevent it from happening, unless we could force elites to pay for it. Organizing in solidarity with refugees. It's no secret that the far right in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere is largely focused on xenophobic appeals. That's, of course, going to increase as climate-related refugee flows increase. Right? Building community agriculture and mutual aid as collective projects that are helpful for community survival and resilience in the face of the climate crisis. And lastly, talking about it. Now, this is, again, not a particularly exciting form of action. But in the United States, I don't know the statistics for any other country, but in the US, 2/3 of the public, 66%, rarely or never talks about the climate crisis with people they know. That's an astounding statistic. So for a small sector of the population, this is a source of intense distress. But for the majority of the population, they have tuned it out almost entirely. So we need to talk about it more. And I will stop there. Went on a bit longer than I was planning, but turn it back over to you, Fabian.
That's great. Thank you very much, Kevin, for this overview and these insights. We give it up for questions now. If you have any, you can either just raise your hand using the Zoom functionality, and then you can ask it verbally, or you can also post in the chat. and I can read it out. Okay, let's go to Leah, please. And I think you're muted. Yeah, excellent.
Thank you so much for all this information that you've generously given us. I am curious about what you think about the need of connections between the various climate folks that are coming against the climate crisis. What connections between organizations do you see are necessary? Because I am new to this world and I see a whole lot of individual organizations doing their very best, but not a collective, let's all link arms and do this together movement. Curious what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, Fabienne, do you want me to reply directly?
Yeah, maybe take it one by one. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So great question. And we have to avoid sectarianism. We have to avoid narrow organizational interest. There are particular institutional and economic reasons why organizations often would go it alone, right? Or be a little territorial. But we need to avoid that. We need to build bridges across organizations. I think that two places where that sort of coalition building has been especially important and impactful is, I alluded briefly to this, but maybe this was when I actually got cut off and you couldn't hear me, but in the struggle against pipelines, oil and gas pipelines in the US, there's been a crucial coalition building happening between self-identified climate organizers and organizers more identified as environmental justice oriented, right? So indigenous communities and nations, Black communities in places like North Carolina, which are organizing primarily against the local pollution from those projects, right? Not necessarily thinking so much about the global greenhouse gas impacts, right? But building coalitions that respect all of those different actors is powerful and has in many cases led to the defeat of particular projects. So that's one area where the coalition building is important. I think that another one is between the climate movement and the labor movement. All right, the labor movement has been slow to come around, of course, on climate. But we've seen some movement, some positive movement in recent years. And the climate organizers need to be very conscientious about reaching out to labor and working class people, and not just the building trades. The building trades tend to be the focus of these conversations, right? The oil and gas and coal workers and the building trade, the pipe fitters and all the rest. But the working class is much broader than that. The union movement is much broader than that. So we need to think expansively about the labor movement when we talk about those coalitions.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. Elodie?
Yes. Hi, thanks a lot for the talk. I think that was really also really useful in the current moment to have a talk that gives a little bit of historical perspective. Yeah, I have a question that relates to, let's say, the scale of the challenge versus the scale of the actions. I've said that repetitively to some people who are also sitting here, but sometimes I really have the feeling that I'm like trying to destroy a wall with a spoon when I look at the kind of actions I'm involved in. And for instance, one thing that came to my mind when you gave these different ideas for the climate movement. So for number 3, for instance, we're targeting financial institutions and investment funds. In Germany, we're currently doing a campaign for VBL, which is like a pension fund that nearly all people who work at universities have to put money in to be more transparent and to stop investing in fossil fuels. And it really directly fits into this. And there's a lot of things that we can do around it to be able to mobilize also more academics to do something and so on. But then it also sometimes feels like we might be able to get a victory on that. It's going to take maybe 2 years, 3 years, but it seems so small compared to the scale of this crisis. And I think that's like it's both like an imagination issue because yeah, it's hard to stay motivated when you have the feeling you're doing something so small, but also a real issue, like, because this is such an all-encompassing problem. It's hard to see what exactly we could achieve. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on this and how to bridge that gap between the scale of the action and the scale of the crisis.
Yeah, thanks for that. This is a great question, and I'm sure other people in the audience have thoughts on it. This is one thing that makes the climate movement a little different and a little more challenging, is that the scale of the problem is so far beyond what most movements organize around, and it's also usually a step removed from people's daily material existence, or at least it appears to be. So I think that to some extent, that's just a problem that we need to overcome through the way that we organize. People, according to research on climate movement mobilization, people are receptive generally to the argument that we are destroying the world for future generations. Right. So there's that concern about future generations can actually be a mobilizing force. But for most people, that's probably not going to be the case. They're not actually going to join the climate movement just for that reason. I think that part of what we need to do is include within our organizing goals particular campaigns with tangible payoffs. Right. So we need to be able to point to concrete victories, and victories not just in terms of reducing demand for fossil fuels or reducing production, but also improving people's material lives. Right. So, I think it's really important for the climate movement to be integrated with other social movements like the labor movement that are fighting for immediate material improvements. And with some kinds of climate campaigns, maybe more than others, it's a little easier to see what those tangible improvements to people's lives could be. Like if we're talking about organizing with labor, we could think about, the way that a movement, a climate movement, a climate labor movement might take on the question of extreme heat in the workplace or something like that, right? So there's a way in which we can also focus on those daily material conditions in addition to the huge, often overwhelmingly huge picture. I'm sure other people have thoughts on that, so maybe that's something we can discuss later.
Thanks, Kevin. Daniela?
Yeah, thank you so much for the very nice talk, and it was really, really inspiring. And connecting to what Elodie was mentioning on the side of the challenge that we are faced with, I wonder, when dealing with focusing on some particular targets, for example, every fossil fuel project that you mentioned, we lose sight of some of the campaigns that other environmental groups are campaigning about. Today, I was talking with some colleagues about the energy shift, and someone rightfully mentioned the need of rare materials for solar panels, for example, which leads also some extractivism problems. But when we focus, so my question is, when focusing on some particular targets that may be more priority than others, we lose sight of some of the other pieces of the puzzle. And how can we effectively deal with that? Is it worth to just keep focusing on one specific campaign, given the success that other movements had with this tactic?
That's a great question. It's a tough one to generalize about. I think a certain amount of strategic flexibility and humility is necessary. As much as I'm proposing specific approaches, the fact is that none of us knows exactly what is going to work for the climate movement as a whole. We can point to some approaches that may be more successful than others, but we are all engaged in a collective trial and error process. And so it is important to be flexible enough to learn from movements elsewhere and campaigns elsewhere, and also to be able to reflect critically on our own current strategies. So, there's an important decision to be made when you are engaged in a campaign about whether the answer is to continue to sustain and escalate that strategy, right? Or whether it makes more sense to shift gears and try something different. So that, which one of those two options is appropriate in a particular juncture is not an easy question to answer. But the most that I can say is that I think we need to be flexible enough and conscious enough of what other organizations and campaigns are doing that we can learn and adapt in circumstances.
Thank you, Kevin. Anna?
Hi, thank you, Kevin, for the great talk. I have a question that came up from actually reading your latest book, which is about the financial economic leverage, which I think is absolutely fundamental for making real pressure on institutions and political decision makers. And you make the example of 1964 and the Civil Rights Act, and one could imagine, and you describe this in your book, that back then the economic pressure on Birmingham's politicians was mostly performed by small and medium business owners in downtown Birmingham. Which actually had power over politicians, and these were small, medium businesses where probably boycott was a bit easier to perform. And they did have an interest in reintegrating Black consumers in their business, and therefore they became on board with the idea of convincing local politicians to perform integration policy. But today, I feel like the economic power over politicians is mostly exerted by big multinationals like Big Fossil or Amazon, Facebook, Apple, McDonald's, whatever you want to name, which are probably much more difficult to boycott first and have no gain from pro-climate policy. So how do we build effective financial and economic leverage today? Asking because I really believe this is super important. Maybe the scale of the economic power we have to deal with today is different, so we need to put different energy in it or organize differently. Yeah, what's your take on this?
Yeah, great question. And it's another question about scale. And so the Birmingham example could be useful in particular local contexts where the boycott target is a local business or a local industry. But you're absolutely right that its direct usefulness to us is limited, right? It was a lot easier for Black consumers in Birmingham to make a substantial difference in the profits of downtown retailers than it is for us to affect giant multinational corporations. So the scale is different. On the other hand, there are examples of these larger scale pressure campaigns having an impact. And one of the best examples is the campaign against apartheid in South Africa. Targeting not just businesses, but also banks. Banks were a crucial target of those divestment campaigns. It's actually not talked about today, at least in my experience, as much as the university-based endowment divestment efforts. But targeting the banks as a strategy actually preceded the growth of the university divestment movement, right? In the late 1970s, banks were central targets. And it was banks' decision to withdraw, really starting with JP Morgan Chase, right? Or what is today JP Morgan Chase, withdrawing and then catalyzing imitation by other banks after that. So that was in 1985. And, of course, JP Morgan Chase is the world's top funder of fossil fuels today. And so those banks did perceive enough of a threat to their interests that they did make a concession to the movement. And in some ways, the situation is a little similar to what we're facing today in that if you think about the percentage of the total investments that those banks had in, say, South Africa was just a tiny percentage of their overall investments. They could pretty easily withdraw from South Africa without really, having to transform their entire business model. With fossil fuels today, fossil fuels are about 1 or 2% of the total invested assets of most of these banks. So they could, despite what they say about how hard it is to divest, they could pretty easily divest themselves of those connections to fossil fuels and still be very profitable enterprises, right? And which is actually good for us. It gives us a little bit more potential leverage, suggesting that it might not be as hard as we might think to put pressure on them. And, so how did the South African movement do that? Well, of course, there was major resistance in South Africa. There was also, this solidarity campaign in many countries around the world targeting banks. And they had some of the strategies that I proposed in that slide with 12 items are similar to what the anti-apartheid movement did. Right? They targeted banks. They organized customers to pledge not to bank with these businesses, to close their accounts with particular banks. I think they might have even tried to organize boycotts in some places of college graduates. But I'm a little fuzzy on that detail. So the point is, I think it is possible to affect them, even though they are these gargantuan multinational corporations.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. I have a couple of questions. Maybe before going to them, there was one in the chat related to your list of 12 commandments. Do you have a sense of prioritization? Right? There's limited resources. If we had to choose, which one were the most important and which one were maybe least important?
Yeah, it's a little hard to answer. I think that for me, the guiding principle there is, how are we situated? How are each of us situated individually? Thinking about our communities, our city or town councils, our state and local governments. Are we union members? Are we members of faith institutions? So are we members of a university community, right? So the places where we devote our energies are going to vary based on what our own position is. So I think that's my general answer to that question. I'm at a university. It's a major public university. It's very large, has hundreds of buildings on campus. It's a huge consumer of fossil fuels. It's also a huge institutional customer of the very dirtiest banks and insurance companies. So I've decided that that's the place that makes most sense for me to focus my energies. But for different people, that's going to be different based on their local and individual context.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you. So if there are no other questions, maybe I can get a chance to ask one. And it's basically a little bit about the theory of change that is kind of in your book or implicit in your book, and I'm curious if you can comment on my understanding of it. And by the way, I really liked this book and also the Levers of Power book, and I can highly recommend them. And you cite John Dewey. Politics is the shadow cast by big business on society, and then you kind of work through historical case studies of how previous movements have built a kind of a sizable disruptive minority, didn't focus too much on electoral strategies, didn't worry too much about majority support, but tried to pressure economic elites and decision makers to then pressure the political elite. And so basically, when if we want to draw kind of a causal diagram of how this all could work out, we would have the climate movement on this side disrupting fossil fuel supporters, so banks, insurers, regulators, through litigation. You mentioned protests, civil disobedience, boycotts, strikes, usually at the local level, and then spreading elsewhere in this cascading fashion, ideally. At the same time, we have favorable market forces and conditions, right? We have renewables being the most cheapest source of energy, and that helps also with litigation, right? Certainly in the case of coal, many of the lawsuits were actually won on economic grounds rather than climate grounds. So we have that, right? And then we have other economic sectors like tourism or real estate, renewables, that may eventually turn against the fossil fuel sector because it is, in a sense, parasitic to their own endeavors and economic interests, right? And then they might help lobby for restricting the fossil fuel sectors. So we have these things, and then what's increasingly happening, suppose that we're winning in the future, banks refuse to provide fossil financing, insurers decline to underwrite fossil projects, governments phase out fossil fuel subsidies, right? And at some point, we have withdrawn enough financial and institutional support that we might be reaching a tipping point. And I think in the book you said this one preprint that 10 to 20% of investors withdrawn leads to a collapse of kind of share price, carbon bubble bursts, probably leads to a wider economic outfall and crisis, geopolitical instability from Russia, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and so on. But it is kind of the end of the fossil fuel era, in a sense. Is that approximating what you think is kind of the theory of change? That we want to basically withdraw our support on this multi-pronged strategy to then have the carbon bubble burst and deal with the economic outfall, rather than having a politician elected and then this person slowly phases it out. So how do you think of that continuation?
Yeah, I think that you summarized my perspective pretty well there. It's not that politicians are entirely trivial. They do have the ability to do certain things which nudge the energy sector in a particular direction. They don't have the power to fundamentally transform the economy, but they can nudge it. But in a capitalist economy where investment capital is overwhelmingly controlled by private actors, the politicians are not the key makers of policy. They're not the key drivers of the policy. And it's easy to forget that because the news cycle follows politicians and what they do so obsessively. But as we can see, even from the Trump administration, that the economic forces in the energy sector were actually more important than what the president and all of his allies in government were doing. So I think you laid it out pretty nicely there. Of course, it's important not to be dogmatic about these things, and again be flexible about and adaptive based on what seems to be working and what doesn't.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I think this is really a key insight. This notion of kind of disrupting the economic sector and the political power following the economic power. And I think your rereading of the case studies is really insightful and worthy of study. Now, you said at the beginning that some of the climate movement is trying to follow this strategy more. And I was wondering, just in your reading of the movement landscape, if you had to put a number on it, like what fraction of the groups are kind of pursuing this disruptive strategy as you laid out, and what fraction is maybe following a different strand that may be less effective in your view?
It's hard to say. I'm not sure I have a good sense. Yeah, I really don't know, but I sense that the organizations that are primarily focused on economic pressure campaigns are definitely in the minority globally. All right, so if we look at, say, Rainforest Action Network or Insure Our Future, Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition, there are some other organizations, especially outside the U.S., that many of their branches focus on these economic targets too. But I think that it's definitely the minority of the movement. I think most of the movement is still kind of election and or legislation focused.
Yeah. So for example, if you have Letzte Generation in Germany, if the group doing a lot of roadblocks demanding from the government to introduce a cheap public transport ticket or citizens' assemblies and so on, you would put them, they get a lot of media coverage, right? They get a lot of news attention because these roadblocks are quite disruptive. They spur anger and so on. So it keeps them in the news cycle. But it doesn't really put pressure on economics, on the economic sector to then influence the political sector. And I guess similar,
No, I am a little skeptical of protest tactics whose main goal is to generate visibility for the issue, because they seem to be operating on a theory of change that says we need to shock and outrage the broader public. And then once we do that, that will somehow lead to change at the level of government and business. And I think that movements don't necessarily need the majority of the public on their side, right? Both the movements that I talked about probably did not have majority support at the time that they won. Certainly the majority was opposed to the tactics that they were following. So, I think that these really flashy public actions designed to generate attention can be useful at times, but I don't think that we should focus our strategy as a movement on that type of action, right? It needs to be more directly disruptive to the people who are actually holding the power. And on the question of disruption, one point that I do think it's interesting or do think it's important to stress here is that disruption is not necessarily self-evident. The most disruptive tactic is not necessarily an illegal one, right? It might well be going to a local bank branch and leafleting every day for a year, right? That is a different form of disruption. It's not flashy and it doesn't generate the same kind of media attention. But we do need to think broadly and flexibly about what it means to be disruptive to the interests of these institutions, right? And it's not necessarily the tactics that we would first gravitate toward.
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe also just the history of Extinction Rebellion a little bit, right at the beginning, kind of taking the square, demanding a climate emergency, citizens' assemblies, net zero by 2025 from the government, and so on. That puts them more in the pressuring legislators, politicians' camp, rather than pressuring the economic sector. And in the Netherlands, Extinction Rebellion has been quite successful recently with this fossil fuel subsidies campaign. I'm not sure whether you've heard of those, where they repeatedly blocked kind of a motorway to draw attention to the fossil fuel subsidies that the government spends every year, 30 billion. And it wasn't even clear how high the fossil fuel subsidies were before the campaign started. But it's interesting there that the demand is towards the government, right? But it is a demand, targeted at the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, I've heard a little bit about that, but I would love to know more and think about how that approach might be replicated elsewhere.
Yeah. Okay, we have one more question by Leah, and then let me
want to preface my question in that I am not suggesting this, but I do have a question about it. And that there was a book recently published called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and essentially making the argument that many of these movements needed a sort of shadow side that either was creating direct violence, not against people, but against the infrastructure. So Malcolm X to MLK, making MLK's demands much more feasible in the eyes of the government and the people at large. What is your thoughts about that within the climate movement?
Yeah, great question, Leah. Thank you. And I see in the chat, Tom wrote it's known as the radical flank effect. comes from some work in the 80s about the civil rights movement, actually, in the United States by a guy named Herbert Haynes, and argued that, yes, the so-called moderate Black organizations benefited from the presence of these groups that were perceived as more radical, right? Concretely, in terms of the fundraising that they were able to generate. And I think that holds true of many movements. It is helpful, I think, to have a radical flank within a movement. You don't need to be working in direct coalition with everyone else, but it can be helpful to have people pursuing a variety of different strategies and tactics. On the question of how to blow up a pipeline and the broader question of violence / property destruction, and I do think that those two concepts are different. Sometimes they get conflated, but not that you were doing that. But I certainly agree that that movements, including the movements that I talked about, do often include some kinds of what we might call low-level use of violence. So even the victory in Birmingham, this is a piece that I didn't mention, but after the business owners and the movement negotiators reached their agreement on May 7th of 1963, 4 days later, there was an attempted bombing of the hotel where King was staying in Birmingham. He wasn't there, but after that bombing attempt, there was a working class riot. Working class Black people in Birmingham rioted the night of May 11th. And that riot actually had an impact in consolidating or strengthening the commitment of the business community to that agreement on integration. And so I think it's wrong to be overly dismissive of tactics which do not necessarily conform strictly to the idea of nonviolence. But at the same time, the caveat to that is that tactics that involve violence or even property destruction are much more likely to incur serious repression from the state. And movements need to be very careful and conscientious about how they make those decisions. The potential benefits need to be weighed carefully against the potential risks and the potential costs.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. Now, if there are no further questions, I would suggest that Aizkoa, you give a little intro to Scientist Rebellion, and then if there's still energy for it, we can make some breakout rooms and have people connect locally. Kevin, thanks again for your time, and of course you're very welcome to stay, but also if you need to head out, no worries. And
yeah,
we'll
I can stick around for a little while anyways. And I'm sorry I haven't had the ability to respond to people's comments and questions in the chat, but I'm seeing a lot of good comments and questions. So
excellent. Aizkoa, take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much. So first of all, thanks a lot, Kevin, for this very motivating talk and for reminding us some important aspects and some hopes as well. And thank you everyone for coming. We are organizing this series as Scientist Rebellion. And now I am here to tell you a little bit of who we are and encourage you all to join us or to support us in any way that you can. So as Fabian mentioned in the beginning, Scientist Rebellion is an international network of scientists and academics and people related to working in science in some way. That primarily engage in nonviolent civil disobedience to create this spark, what we call the
revolution, the climate revolution that we need, which is no more, no less than what the IPCC tell us that we need to do, which is huge changes across all sectors affecting, basically everything that we do in society, how we organize our economy, our society, and everything else. So we do need as many people as possible, and we believe that as scientists and academics, we are very well placed to be leading these movements, because we have some trust from the public, at least more than other kind of activists that can be dismissed sometimes as naive students that don't know anything about life. So scientists do know how serious the problem is. We understand the data, and we believe that we should be leading by example. So we should be putting ourselves out there, risking our career and our freedom in some way, to show that really the stakes are so high, and we that know it from the first hand are willing to do that. And our theory of change is based on that. In order to change everything that needs to be changed sufficiently rapidly, large parts of society need to go into civil resistance, meaning that we need to stop collaboration with the system and create this that Kevin mentioned before, this disruption of capital that is sustained and escalates and never goes down. So as scientists as well, we try to leverage our powers, because we exist in institutions like the university that have a lot of potential for change. And right now they are more often part of the problem than the solution, but we try to change that. And yes, this is basically what we are about. We usually do a couple of internationally coordinated campaigns a year, although this can vary. We are international. We have chapters in every continent, I believe. And one of our strengths is that we are very well internationally connected, because the scientific community is very international. So we try to build on that and organize campaigns that are international as well as national, of course, and local. Each chapter is free to organize the campaigns and actions that make more sense in their context, as long as they are aligned with our goals and values. So I put here some links to our codes about our mission statement and ways to join us, ways to support us economically. And if you identify yourselves as a scientist, I encourage you to talk with us and see how you can get involved, or at least get connected to us. We held international welcome meetings every Monday at 7 p.m. Central European Time. Those are in English, so you can come any Monday and talk with us. And also, I'm very happy to stay for discussion now a little bit, so that we can get to know each other and connect